Wild Tales is sponsored by Cotswold Outdoor. When we're out in the elements, we're in our element. And outside retail expert Cotswold Outdoor is helping more of us to get out with the right kit. Thanks also to their support, the National Trust is helping walking communities to access the UK's outside spaces. And we're working to fix 15,000 kilometres of paths and trails by 2030 for everyone to enjoy. Find your element with Cotswold Outdoor.
Ferns were considered to be safe because they were essentially asexual. So if your daughter or your wife was very into ferns, that was considered far less stimulating than if she was into something like orchids that Victorians felt looked particularly sensual.
Today we're travelling back to an age of discovery. It's the mid-1800s and Britain has succumbed to a mania for collecting leafy green non-flowering plants, ferns. And this new nature craze is about to be taken to the extreme. I'm Ranger Rosie Holdsworth. Welcome to Wild Tales, Pteridomania, when fern frenzy swept the UK. Are you a proud houseplant parent? I love putting my plants in the shower to water them and pretend that I live in a rainforest. I've got a lot of enthusiasm for all my plant babies, but I do get out of my depth caring for them. Houseplants are a huge trend amongst millennials and Gen Z. We largely owe our modern green-fingered habits to the Victorians' total obsession with botany. And pteridomania, or fern frenzy, was one of the biggest crazes of all time. So who were the pteridomaniacs? Why was fern frenzy really a lot about sex? And what can we learn about the conservation consequences when the craze went too far?
Pteridomaniacs, or fern hunters, they would really go to extremes to collect the best specimens and get quite competitive about it.
This is Clara Woolford, Curator at Cragside in Northumberland.
One of the people that we know a lot about is a gentleman called Charles Drury. He writes about how on one expedition in Devonshire, and Devonshire was the place to go fern hunting, he tries to dislodge what he calls a very desirable hart's tongue fern that's growing out the side of a bridge that's spanning a really fast-flowing stream. Because he can't get to it, he decides to lean over the side with a trowel, which he's lashed to a stick, and then sort of pokes the fern out and catches it in an open umbrella that he's suspended underneath the arch of the bridge with a piece of string, and then has to wade into the river to retrieve this fern.
So how exactly did the fern craze start?
Pteridomania, which is really hard to say, and it's even harder to spell because it has a silent P at the start. It basically means fern madness. And it was coined in 1855 by a writer and a botanist called Charles Kingsley. He is most well known for his fairy tale, The Water Babies, but it really takes over the whole of Victorian society in a way that is quite unbelievable.
For the Victorians, collecting and categorising things was an obsession and way of life. This was applied to lots of things, and especially natural history.
It's obviously the period of Charles Darwin. This is the era of taxonomy and working out family trees between different species. It's a period where they are discovering and exploring the world.
Ferns themselves are an ancient plant recognisable by their feathery leaves or fronds. The plant life first appeared around 400 million years ago, before the time of the dinosaurs. Around 60 varieties grow in the UK. Bracken is the most common fern, and we have lots of other species with fun names like brittle bladder, scaly male, and maidenhair. Maidenhair, by the way, is not named after the hair on your head. And in the 19th century, a culmination of social conditions means it's suddenly easy for hobbies like fern hunting to go viral.
It goes from that kind of intellectual elite down to people in their own homes collecting. And I think it's also a sign of that period that there's mass media, there's journals for just about every hobby and interest. And that actually is probably quite similar to us today with, things like Pinterest and TikTok, and you can find your community. And thanks to things like the railway, so this brilliant new technology, the British countryside is suddenly far more accessible to ordinary people. And there was all sorts of fern hunting paraphernalia that was marketed as well. So you could buy specialist trowels and little specimen pots to put your ferns in, because you had to try and keep them alive on the journey home. Albums of specimens, special cases that they'd make tiny museums in their homes. It's really encouraged and a real kind of fashionable thing to be doing.
So who were these fashionable pteridomaniacs?
The Victorian fern craze gets very associated with young women. Charles Kingsley, who coins the term, how he describes it is slightly patronising. So he says, your daughters perhaps have been seized with the prevailing Pteridomania, wrangling over unpronounceable names of species which seem different in every new fern book that they buy. And yet you cannot deny that they find enjoyment in it and are more active, more cheerful, more self-forgetful over it than they would have been over novels, gossip, crochet and Berlin wool.
Victorian society also wanted to associate young women with ferns for another reason. Ferns are asexual and so deemed appropriate plants for the sensitive female mind.
It's considered a more wholesome activity because ferns don't flower. It wasn't really understood how ferns reproduced, and around this period is when they start to understand the idea of spores. But essentially, unlike a flowering plant that has sexual organs, that idea that bees have to come and pollinate a flowering plant, the Victorians who saw sex everywhere, that had connotations that they didn't want to associate with young ladies. Whereas ferns were considered to be safe in that regard because they were essentially asexual. So if your daughter or your wife was very into ferns, that was considered far less stimulating than if she was into something like orchids that Victorians felt looked particularly sensual.
The Victorians might have wanted to stop young women botanists getting sex into their heads, but young women had something else in mind.
Fern hunting was something that could be done as a group of men and women, which was quite unusual for the Victorian period. This is because young women, very into ferns, if they wanted to go out into the British countryside, it would be highly inappropriate for them to do that unchaperoned. So it's also a very physical activity. So it might not be something where they're taking along a more elderly female relative. So they're being accompanied by young men. But it was well acknowledged that these groups were often being used for more illicit assignations. Punch magazine, that was a really popular satirical magazine, they print in 1869 an article that suggests that botanizing, which is the term they use, which I love, is a good way of exploring less frequented spots with what they refer to as a blooming companion.
It's not just young women who get in on fern frenzy. It's everywhere. At its peak in the mid-1800s, fern parties are so common they're competing for the same patches in the British countryside. As with many of our obsessions, people take the fern craze to the extreme, and there are very real consequences. There are stories from the era of unlucky fern collectors whose bodies are discovered at the bottom of cliffs after going too far to reach the best ferns. And then, of course, there are the serious conservation consequences to the ferns themselves. Ferns play an important role in the ecosystem. Growing where very little else can, they provide shelter and shade for other species, and their structure protects against soil erosion. So stripping them en masse from their habitats is a big environmental problem.
So Edward Lowe, who was a very famous fern breeder in the 1890s, despairs of fern gangs. So there are literally gangs of raiders going out into the English countryside and stealing ferns, collecting ferns en masse to sell them on. They're also stealing them from private estates. And others were noting that ferns in Kent and Devon were becoming nearly extinct. large areas of the British countryside are being stripped of ferns and they're not being able to reproduce fast enough.
And there was the complicated issue of colonial plant hunters taking ferns from other countries. This was often done without any consideration for conservation or permission from local communities.
So people that are being tasked to bring these ferns back for nurseries to sell, they're just stripping out ferns and other plants from ecosystems without any consideration about what that impact might be. So there's not a kind of a thought given to what happens if you take away all of the breeding plants from an area in one go.
By the end of the 19th century, fern frenzy has got everywhere. Fern designs and patterns appear on everything, from curtains to garden benches to crockery. And you might not have even noticed the ferns on one of the nation's favourite treats.
That curly, swirly pattern on a custard cream, that's actually fern fronds. So every time you're eating a custard cream, you're part of that fern mania cult.
Fern frenzy's legacy is still found in how we behave today. The Victorians' influence can be seen in our love of houseplants and gardening. And, like the pteridomaniacs, lots of us get really into our hobbies and sharing and showing off our interests. But these days we understand a lot more about conservation. Thankfully, many common fern species are still a familiar sight in the British countryside. And we now know that the best way to enjoy ferns is to head out into the places where they can grow undisturbed in their ancient green glory. Thanks for listening to this episode of Wild Tales. If you want to explore the fern frenzy for yourself, Cragside in Northumberland is home to one of the UK's biggest and best preserved fern collections. You can explore rockeries, grottos and glasshouses in the expansive gardens. For more from Wild Tales, follow us on your favourite podcast app and find us on Instagram at WildTalesNT. Why not share your own tales with the hashtag WildTalesWednesdays? See you next time. Wild Tales is sponsored by Cotswold Outdoor, your outside retailer and epic guides to adventure. Quick breathers, calming walks, or heart-pounding hikes, we feel better when we get out more. Find quality kit and 50 years of outdoor wisdom. Plus, National Trust supporters get 15% off walking kit in-store and online. Feel in your element, in the elements at Cotswold Outdoor.